In class, we talked about the allegory of the cave. The allegory is just a story. It's an illustration. It's an analogy. It's meant to tell you a point. Now, the point is pretty simple. The point is stop paying attention to shadows. Stop paying attention to just the surface. Stop paying attention to just appearances. After all, what's really real is not what you just see. What's real is what causes what you see. So with the allegory of the cave, Plato beckons us to leave the world of the superficial, the shadows, and enter the real world. And in that spirit, I decided to leave my office and enter the real world. Here I am. So to enter the real world, Plato gives us 4 kinds of knowledge: imagining, or imagination, or imaging, belief, thinking, and finally, intelligence. Let's take a look at all 4 of these. Now, imagining, or even what we might just call imaging, is the most superficial, the most simple kind of knowledge. It's what happens in the cave when we're just looking at shadows. Imaging is simply what you see. It's the content of your senses. It's just appearances. I see greens, grays, blues. The light is failing, so I see more shadows. I smell the air. I feel the hard ground. There's rough rock beneath me. I can hear it when I stamp on it. This is just the appearances. It's the images. It's what you get with the senses. It's what Plato calls imaging. And it's what you get, like I said, what you get in the cave. Belief is the next step of knowledge. Belief takes what you have from images, from the imaging, but it doesn't stop there. Now, right now, I do see many things. I do have many impressions, many images, many smells. The temperature's even dropping a little bit right now, since the sun is fading beneath the hills. Now, these different images are, they're still the same things, but the images change. The images belong to some things and not to others. So when I stamp the ground, that sound belongs to the stone. But if I were to knock on the wood, it makes a different sound. Now, what happens with belief is when I start to associate some images with some objects, but not others, even coming to believe that there are objects. Now, if I were to come out here during a different time of day, the images would be different. The smells would be different. The temperature would be different. Even the appearances of the trees and the sky would be different. They'd be affected by the light. Through belief, I come to be able to associate all these different images with these objects. I recognize that the images will change with the objects. Belief is the next step above images. It's, what we might even associate with like common knowledge. That might be a good idea. It's still pretty simple. It's still limited, but the idea is I have different images associated with one object and one object alone. Or maybe a better idea is I understand how the images for an object change in different circumstances. So we have imaging, we have we have belief, and now we have thinking. Thinking is more advanced than belief. As a matter of fact, there's a lot more going on. Just as there's a lot more going on in the sciences than is what's happening with just common knowledge or just common belief. Now, with thinking, you're really starting to abstract away from the particular objects. With imaging, you associate those perceptions with that object. And with belief, you start to recognize how the object has different kinds of images or perceptions in different kinds of circumstances. Well, with thinking, you start to abstract away from that. You're starting to categorize the different kinds of perceptions that you even have. So looking around me now, I see some blues and grays and some greens. I see green over here and some blues and grays. And I see another kind of green down here with the leaves. But I recognize that's a green and that's also a green. And so I abstract away the color from the different objects. Even so with the sky. The sky right now is a fading shade of blue. It's starting to turn more yellow. But there's a similarity, at least to my eyes, I'm a little colorblind, there's a similarity between this color of the sky and some of the bark. And some of the bark has shades of blue in it. So I abstract away that color. Not just color, but even sounds. Not just even the perceptions that we have. Right? So remember, we started talking about how our minds like to abstract away patterns. And patterns are not the things that we see. Patterns are things that we understand. Well, this is the next big step in thinking. It's starting to abstract away, starting to find patterns. So one pattern is the structure of the trees, right? This one's a little bit different than the rest because it's arching over this way, because it's leaning over to the side. But that's not completely uncommon. Some of these trees go straight up and down. Some are very crooked. But there is a common pattern, namely from they grow up to the top. They grow from the ground up to the top. They grow up. There are more patterns to see out here. The way that the branches split off, the leaves themselves. Thinking starts to look at these different patterns. And we start to see how patterns in one object, and even one kind of object, mimics patterns in others. Thinking is this beginning of abstraction. Thinking starts leading us to intelligence. Well, we haven't exhausted the end of abstraction with numbers and colors, shapes and structures. There are lots of ways to abstract. There are lots of ways to start seeing the world. Even with just actions. Actions, we're not dealing with physical objects anymore. We're dealing with we're dealing with objects as they go through processes. Maybe it's another word for it. There's a way to start categorizing actions. We typically call them just and unjust, good and evil. But good and evil are not patterns that you see in objects. There's something that's not seen at all. Again, these are things that are understood. As we're getting more, and as we're getting higher and higher to this idea of thinking, the level of abstraction goes up. The idea is that we're starting to pull away from the objects themselves. And using Plato's allegory of the cave, we are stepping out of the cave and into what's real. For in Plato's eyes, we're finally getting to that point where we're starting to see the real objects. This is that moment where we're out of the cave. The sun hurts our eyes, and we see the things around us. With thinking, we're going towards abstraction. So in Plato's mind, abstraction, the abstract things, are more real than these particular things themselves. Thinking also starts us towards intelligence. And you might wonder, what more is there? We've started with corporeal objects. We've abstracted away from those. We're starting to get what Plato calls the forms, the abstracts, the universals. How can you involve intelligence any more than you have? After all, you're dealing with abstract objects. Well, Plato says, wait. The ride's not over yet. The light is starting to fail now. My senses are starting to fail me as far as understanding the real world. I might as well be back in that cave. For Plato, it doesn't matter, though. Plato is going to say that our senses fail us anyway in trying to understand the real world. If we're going to understand the real world, it's not going to be through images. Images are a start, but that's not it. Images are just a surface matter. Next is belief. Then we go on to thinking. And finally, with thinking, we start to encounter the real objects. With thinking, I've left that cave. I've come out and encountered the real world. The next step is intelligence. But what is there to see? Haven't I already dealt with what's coming from the real objects? From the corporeal objects? I've investigated the world a lot. I understand number, causation, good, evil, justice. What more is there? Well, Plato would say, there's a lot more. You're not done abstracting. There's something that even the forms have in common. This something is truth, beauty, being, existence. These are the real things, not what's in that cave. What's in the cave are just shadows. What's out here in the full light of abstraction, in the full light of understanding, that's what's real. Well, I'm going to see how well abstraction guides me bumping into trees during the night. You might wonder, why is it so important to have this further abstraction to begin with? After all, what more is there to gain by further abstraction? Well, for Plato, the further abstraction helps us to see how everything is related to everything else. Recall the idea behind abstractions to begin with. To understand that particular tree, I can understand that particular tree better by understanding what trees have in common, by understanding their nature, by understanding what makes trees trees. So I've understood the particular things better by understanding the abstraction thing, by understanding the abstract. We'll keep going up. We've moved from imaging to belief, moved from belief to thinking. Now I understand the abstractions of trees and rocks and sky and wind. I understand the causal relations between these things. I understand number. If I abstract even further, as what happens with intelligence, when I go from numbers, justice, goodness, causation, material, immaterial, from these abstractions I go further to truth, I understand those better because I understand what truth is, because I see how it's all related. For Plato, if you understand truth, you understand everything. It's an ambitious goal.